Welcome to Global Connections with Robert Siegel, Navigating the New Normal, presented by the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. Our monthly Leaders Forum addresses vital issues facing society and the economy, real estate and medicine, technology and science. My name is Dr. Joshua Clout. I'm the Executive Director of American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, AFRMC, a 501c3 national American charitable organization based in New York City. We at AFRMC represent Israel's premier hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petah Tikva in Greater Tel Aviv, the leading institution named in honor of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. The hospital is a model of coexistence as it serves 1 million patients annually from all ethnic and religious backgrounds with the same compassionate care. Please support our mission in this free public affairs program with a donation of any amount. Visit us, American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, online and donate at afrmc.org. Join us on social media, on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, and our Facebook page and discussion group. We depend on our audience's support to help the hospital in Israel. So thank you if you can contribute any amount. Our host and moderator for Global Connections is Robert Siegel, former host of All Things Considered on National Public Radio for 31 years. Over the course of an hour each month, Global Connections features guests who Robert Siegel interviews as they explore important issues in our world. Today's Global Connections topic is the economy in the Ukrainian war. Thank you to our very special guest, Professor Jason Furman at the Kennedy School at Harvard University, the former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama. AbbyJoseph Cohen, professor at Columbia University Business School and former senior investment strategist for Goldman Sachs. And JohnCassidy, author and columnist for the New Yorker magazine. And now, Global Connections with Robert Siegel.
Thank you, Josh. Several weeks ago, when we decided to focus this month on the state of the economy, it seemed a timely topic. The administration had acknowledged the gravity of inflation. The president was about to make his first official State of the Union address. A big chunk of his domestic agenda was being blocked by a couple of reluctant senators of his own party. Could have made for a good hour. Then came the event that has reshaped public discourse around the world. Russia invaded Ukraine. The Ukrainians are battling the Russians on their own with some material support from both NATO members and some other countries. But those NATO members and other countries, mostly led by us, have chosen to respond to Russian aggression in Ukraine on the economic front with very tough sanctions, sanctions that threaten the Russians with everything from making their assets and overseas markets inaccessible to kicking them out of sports competitions, barring their artists from the world's great opera halls and symphony halls. How did this all come about? And what effect might these sanctions have on our economy and, for that matter, on the economies of our friends and allies in Europe? If we dare to ask, were it not for Russia and COVID, how's our economy doing? These are big questions, and we have an excellent panel of three guests to address them. After we hear from each, we'll have a half an hour of discussion and questions. You can submit a question by using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Our first panelist is JohnCassidy, who writes about politics and economics for The New Yorker, where he's been a staff writer since 1995. He's the author of two books, How Markets Fail, The Logic of Economic Calamities, and .con, How America Lost Its Mind and Money in the Internet Era. JohnCassidy, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks very much for inviting me on.
And I want you, as the journalist on our panel, to first help take us through what's happened on the economic front of the war in Ukraine. We went from thinking that the cost of a Russian invasion would be the sort of sanctions that wouldn't do too much damage to the Russians because they are the gas station in Europe's backyard. And instead, what we've seen is a very tough sanctions regime. What happened?
Well, I think basically what happened is Putin has miscalculated. As you say, he thought that Russia was a sanction-proof economy for two reasons. One, as you say, the Europeans are extremely dependent on Russian oil and even more so on natural gas, which makes up to nearly 50% of the EU's natural gas imports. Countries like Germany and Italy, even in the run-up to the war, were expressing great skepticism about the possibility of energy sanctions. And I think Putin thought he could survive anything but that. Turns out he was actually mistaken about that too, because he also underestimated the force of the financial sanctions which the West has introduced. So I think we've basically seen a bunch of miscalculations on his part and sort of underestimation of how the invasion itself would have a transformative political effect, which in turn has transformed the sort of financial and economic repercussions.
I'm curious if Putin is surprised by how Europe responded to what happened. Are you surprised by how Europe responded to what happened?
I must say I am. I mean, I'm as guilty as anybody else. I wrote a piece a couple of weeks before the invasion saying, look, Putin, the Russians, that whatever Putin decides, economics probably won't be the decisive factor in his mind simply because of the factors I laid out. And I think if you'd have interviewed virtually anybody in Europe, including the European leaders who have now done a 180 on this, they would have given you the same answer. Yeah. In fact, you know, the former head of the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi, who's now the president of, Prime Minister of Italy, he himself warned against broad sanctions just a week or so before the war started.
On the eve of the Russian invasion, much of the criticism over the sanctions, much of the criticism that I heard focused on the system called SWIFT, which I confess I had never heard of until this debate. We weren't blocking Russian banks' access to SWIFT. The argument went, so the sanctions weren't tough enough. Now, you would say that what we actually did, people were missing the point that the sanctions that were imposed were bigger than blocking Russian access to SWIFT.
I mean, SWIFT in itself was sort of seen by some people as a nuclear option, but I always thought that was a bit of a exaggeration. People say that SWIFT is a financial transfer mechanism. It's actually not. It's a financial messaging service which banks use to confirm and alert each other to financial transfers. There are actually potential ways around it. You can send old-fashioned telexes, etc. It's very awkward. But I don't think the SWIFT sanction by itself would have decimated the USSR.
But the novel and very tough step here was sanctioning the central bank.
Exactly. Nobody, I don't think, on the Russian or even on the European side initially thought of the sanctions against the central bank, which really hit the Russian financial system, you know, they call them financial warfare. Like they just created a huge crater in their financial system. Because if you remember, the Russians had spent a long time building up their financial reserves, their foreign exchange reserves. They have over $600 billion in foreign reserve assets. Virtually everybody thought that would be enough to protect the ruble. If people started selling the ruble, they could intervene like all central banks do and buy it. But they made the mistake of leaving when nobody knows for sure, but roughly 2/3 of these financial reserves, foreign reserves in foreign countries, the US, the UK, France, China, we're not sure exactly where they are. But basically by sanctioning the central bank, the allies have been able to freeze that money. And that's what's caused real consternation in Moscow.
As the allies were doing that, Americans were already feeling the pain of rising inflation. What impact could cutting off Russian oil or gas, or for that matter, grain exports, what impact might it have on the cost of living here?
Well, I'll leave the details of that to Jason. I'm sure okay. Simulations of it, but obviously the first round repercussions are pretty obvious. The oil price has already, gone from about $70, $75 to $130 at one point. It come back again on the day, fallen bit today as we're speaking, but still 30 or 40% up above what it was. Some people are talking about it going even higher. That you already see in California, which is actually quite dependent on Russian oil for some technical reasons,
Mm.
the price of gasoline there is already over $5 and $6 in some stations. We could see $5 oil across the country in the coming weeks. That's a first round. That's the first round of impact on the cost of living. And then, of course, energy is a component and a input to all sorts of other productive processes. And as time goes on, it will also impact the cost of living through other industries.
We do have other economic issues in the country apart from inflation and apart from the war in Ukraine. One is the phenomenon that's been called the Great Resignation. Are Americans, in fact, leaving the workforce, or are they quitting bad jobs to get better jobs?
Well, I mean, I think it's a bit of both. We saw over the pandemic, there was a lot more quitting. We've got some figures this week as well confirmed quitting is still at record highs in the US economy. I think the latest figure, Jason, I'm sure will be able to confirm this, about 2.93% of the labor force people are quitting every month. That's a remarkable figure. Two things seem to have happened over the course of the pandemic. One, first round of resignations, people just got very nervous. A lot of older members of the labor force just said, okay, I've had enough. I don't fancy risking it. I'll go back into retirement or take early retirement. But then what we've seen in this more recently, especially in the lower wage parts of the labor market, a complete sort of turnaround. For decades, people in those jobs have had zero bargaining power and have basically seen no wage growth at all and big wage cuts in real terms. That's completely flipped around, and there are far more jobs than there are people willing to do those jobs in those industries now, and wages have increased at a rate which we haven't seen in decades. Now, some of that wage growth has been rubbed out by the big jump in inflation, but in things like hotels and restaurants, wages have been rising at sort of 15% or so last year. So that's still twice the rate of inflation. So
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, so that is I think when people talk about the Great Resignation, that's what they're referring to mainly, rather than people dropping out of the labor force because of COVID. But they're both part of the same phenomenon, really.
As our audience may have guessed, you're originally from the north of England. So you could tell folks in Ohio and West Virginia something about what it feels like for jobs to disappear and go overseas. When you heard President Biden in the State of the Union promising to buy American, were you convinced that that's practical and beneficial, or are we hooked on foreign labor and open markets and things built in the countries where people work for cheap?
Yeah, I mean, I'm old enough. I mean, I probably can't tell from my accent, but I've been in the US a long time. I first arrived in 1984, and I covered the '88 campaign going back that long. And if you remember, Dick Gephardt ran on a Buy in America ticket then. So, that's what, it's longer ago than I care to think, 30 odd years ago. So, this Buy American message has been around for a long time. It went away in the sort of late 90s, early 00s when we all bought into globalization and sort of China as a source of cheap imports. But it now, of course, it's back because we've seen the downside of globalization over the last 2 decades.
JohnCassidy, thanks. I think you can turn another light on in your room, by the way, while we're talking with AbbyJoseph Cohen. But thanks, and stick around for another quarter hour, 20 minutes for the question and answer session. And we will now turn to our second panelist, AbbyJoseph Cohen, who spent a career as an economist and financial analyst. She is now professor of business at Columbia University's School of Business. She started out at the Federal Reserve in Washington as a staffer and went from there into the private sector. AbbyJoseph Cohen is best known for her time at Goldman Sachs, where she went to work in the 1990s and rose to become the firm's senior investment strategist. I'm just going to mention that among her many non-financial, primary business activities, Abby has been chair of the board of Jewish Theological Seminary. Welcome back. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Robert.
We've heard about the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia. They come at a time when the U.S. is experiencing a burst of inflation, and energy costs at the pump seem to be leading the way. If, in fact, for everything that's delivered by truck in the U.S., every gallon of gasoline or diesel fuel costs more, will more sanctions compound an already serious problem?
Well, Robert, let's make the following observation. We have seen this notable rise at the pump before the crude that costs more has even arrived here. Mm-hmm. right? So what we basically see is that the cost at the pump has risen, shall we say, in an opportunistic manner. And I, for one, find that somewhat disturbing.
Are you saying price gouging? Is that the phrase that?
One could use that expression, yes, because there don't seem to be any constraints at this point with regard to supply in the United States. So yes, I think that those prices have risen. Let's just call it prematurely. Number one. Number two, I am concerned about, let's call it, the public relations and expectations aspect of what's going on. So for example, on the evening news and the morning news every day, the economic report is almost always, this is what's happening at the gas pump. There's not really an analysis of what's happening in other markets, how large a component this is of the family budget. And I recognize that this can be significant for some families, but for the time being, I think there's something of a, shall we call it, a news media overreaction to what has happened thus far.
We are not heavily dependent on Russian gasoline or petroleum or natural gas, but say Germany and Italy and other countries in Europe are. Are the sanctions likely to prove really difficult for our European friends and allies?
Yeah, great point, because the United States in many ways has an economy that is much more protected than are the economies in Europe. Part of it has to do with the fact that Russia simply is not a significant trade partner with the United States. You know, lots of people are talking about the 3% of our energy that we import from Russia. But let's keep in mind that even before the sanctions, there were sanctions that occurred anyway, because the insurance companies immediately upon the invasion by the Russians of Ukraine, the insurance companies basically said they're not providing coverage for any of the tankers that weren't already filled and on their way back. So whether those sanctions have been imposed or not, there was a de facto sanction created. But in Europe, there is much more of an impact. First of all, because they are more dependent upon energy supplies from Russia than are we. And number two, several economies, including Germany, do trade much more with Russia than does the United States. And let's keep in mind that the Russian economy overall is not that big an economy. It's roughly $1.7 trillion in dollar terms. And to contrast that to the United States, which is roughly $21 trillion in size.
Although, I mean, it's as an old joke goes, you can teach it round or teach it flat. The 12th biggest economy in the world, I guess, is smaller than Italy's, but it's pretty big. You know, it's a player in the world economy. You know,
it's a player, and it's an undiversified player, which is what creates some of the problem. So they sort of, you know, play over their welterweight status with regard to energy and also with regard to wheat. And that is something that should raise some concern in combination with the fact that Ukraine is often referred to as the breadbasket of Europe. So if in fact there are shortfalls with regard to exports of wheat, not just from Russia, but also from Ukraine, that could be a problem. And it helps explain the Chinese involvement here as well, because the Chinese are important customers of both those two countries for those grains. Keep in mind that China is a large country, but it underperforms with regard to agriculture, in large part because it doesn't have arable water.
I'd like now to turn to the President's State of the Union address and the part where he talked about buying American. How realistic is that? How desirable is it after, as we heard from JohnCassidy, some years of celebrating globalization to attempt to reindustrialize the United States?
Yeah, you know, there are the statements that are made for political purposes, but there's also what we're seeing happening on the ground. And I do think that we have seen the shift away from, let's call it offshoring, to a new expression. There's reshoring, where some forms of production are coming back to the United States, but perhaps even more powerful than that will be so-called nearshoring. One of the things that the pandemic did was open our eyes with regard to the fragility of the global supply chain. If you're relying on providers and producers a very long distance away, maybe that's not so clever, particularly for items that you really need, including things that are important for defense, important for public health, and so on. And so over the last 2 years, we have seen that many companies have moved without any sort of legislation towards nearshoring. They're trying to bring production back either into the United States or into neighbors such as Canada and Mexico. And the other thing that's happening as well is a diversification of where production is occurring. And so, for example, during the so-called period of great globalization, the reality is that not every country participated. China was a great beneficiary, but many neighbors of China were not. And what we've seen over the last handful of years has been that some of the production in Asia has moved out of China, but into China's neighbors and into some countries that tend to be a little bit friendlier towards the West.
I see your point about nearshoring being beneficial to a great many companies, but at the same time, it was no solace to workers in the upper Midwest that the factory they worked in moved only to Mexico and that it's just across the border. It wasn't in Michigan anymore. Was the key point? It wasn't even in the U.S.
Sure.
Is nearshoring?
Yeah, point well taken, Robert. And we need to discuss a couple of other reasons why jobs were lost. One reason has to do with technology itself and the impact on worker productivity. The reality is that the United States is producing more manufactured goods now than ever before, but we're doing it with fewer workers, number one. And number two, very importantly, we've not done what we need to as a nation to find new jobs, new vocations for those workers. One of the things that has happened during the course of economic history is that when there have been the structural changes, these have been accompanied, when successful, with changes with regard to retraining workers and building up new industries. And we've not done that. So, for example, in the past, when there was the shift from the heavy metal bending industries of the 1950s and 60s into more sophisticated advanced manufacturing, it was the employers themselves that did a great deal of the retraining. And there was also retraining and training for new positions provided by community colleges. This time around, very little of that. The absence of that social contract between employers and employees has meant that companies are doing what they used to with regard to retraining existing workers, number one. Number two, the idea that workers expect to continue to work for the same employer throughout their careers, that contract has broken. And number three, we have not been providing as a nation the same level of funding that we had been previously for things like community colleges and other forms of technical training. The good news has been during the pandemic is that many state and local governments that did receive financial assistance from the federal government, they have used those funds to actually reboot many of their community college programs.
AbbyJoseph Cohen, thank you, and stick with us for the Q&A session in about 10 minutes. Our third panelist today is Professor Jason Furman, who teaches the practice of economic policy at Harvard's Kennedy School and at the university's Department of Economics. His involvement in making economic policy spans about 20 years by my count. As a graduate student, he was hired for a one-year stint as a staff economist for Bill Clinton's White House Council of Economic Advisors. He was economic policy director for the Democratic presidential campaigns of John Kerry and Barack Obama. And during the Obama administration, he rose to be chairman of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Jason Furman, welcome, and thank you for taking part today.
Great to be here.
When it comes to giving a president economic policy advice, you've been there. So let's say Joe Biden were to ask you right now, hey, we have inflation at a level that Americans only remember if they're frankly, if they're a little bit younger than Joe Biden. It's a problem. Americans are unaccustomed to it. Our Ukraine policy may exacerbate that problem. What do I do? What's the right policy move now? What do you say?
The first thing I'd say is there are some things that are even more important than inflation. And right now, what's happening in Ukraine is just much more profoundly important. I worked on Russia's sanctions in 2014 and 2015. And the main message in all of my analysis for President Obama was everything we're doing is incredibly asymmetric. Yes, it has some cost to the United States. It has a much greater cost to Russia. That is true of all the sanctions under discussion now. And so all of those should be evaluated not by their impact on US inflation or US GDP, but their impact on Russia's ability to wage war and the future of Ukraine. So that would be the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say on inflation is not that great a message for him to have in the public, which is that he should do everything he can. Open up ports, get more people into trucking, look into some of the concentration, monopoly issues in the economy, but that's just not going to add up to a whole lot. That the main two solutions here are time and the Federal Reserve.
And the Federal Reserve has its own issues, but how much time? I mean, how long? When inflation was dismissed as a transitory problem by the administration, that seemed to suggest that within a matter of months, a season, we'd be back to normal. Is that still the case, or should we buckle in for a couple of years?
If you take the very best economic models we have of inflation, they would tell you it's going to go away quite quickly because long-term inflation expectations haven't moved very much. You look at forecasts of inflation over the next 10 years by financial markets or economic forecasters, they haven't changed very much. The problem with the very best economic models is that they just weren't that good 2 years ago, and they failed terribly last year.
Yeah.
And so that makes me not want to use the so-called Phillips curve that some people talk about, and instead look at indicators like what do businesses say about price increases? They say they're going to raise them quite a lot. What's the momentum in nominal wage setting? It's quite high. Will wages pass through to prices and prices to wages? Well, we haven't seen that in the last 25 years, but we also haven't seen inflation like this, and it sort of stands to reason we would. So I am deeply uncertain, but I'm pretty worried that we're going to continue to have a decently high level of inflation for the next couple of years.
When you've, as you say, you worked on Russia sanctions during the Obama administration, when you look at the current sanctions against Russia, is the point actually to deprive the Russians of the economic wherewithal to wage war, or is it to make life in Russia so uncomfortable that even in a system that is certainly undemocratic, but in some respect responsive to opinion, that they have to back off this this policy because the people of Russia will feel penalized by it and cut off from the world? Which is it? What's it supposed to do?
I think different policymakers have different views on those two questions. So part of it is just punishment. Part of it is trying to change behavior. Part of it is depriving the war machine, because there's no scenario other than complete Russian capitulation in which this doesn't last for a while. They'll occupy part of the country, there'll be a resistance, etc. So the ability of them to fly planes and roll tanks 6 months from now is unfortunately probably going to matter. I think people probably are looking at other countries too, most notably China and Taiwan, and the conflict there, and trying to have some deterrence.
You mean that there must be an example showing that when big countries try to gobble up small neighbors whom they claim to be historically indistinct?
Yeah,
and,
yeah, I think that has to be in the back of at least some policymakers' heads.
As for the question of Europe and the impact of the impact of these sanctions, are Russian natural gas and petroleum inevitably part of Europe's near-term future, or can you imagine substitutions that could be affordable and that exist within the next few years that would permit Europeans to power and to warm their countries without depending on Russia?
The next few years, absolutely, yes. Europe can free itself of its dependence on Russian fossil fuels. The much tougher question is, can Europe do it by next winter?
Mhm.
The good news is natural gas is incredibly seasonal, and you need a lot of it coming in ahead of the winter. That gives you about 8 months to figure out alternatives. There have been a couple different groups which have tried to find out, figure out what Europe could do right now to replace the natural gas coming in. Where could it cut back? Where could it get something else? Where could it switch to a different energy source? If you're not wildly optimistic, but a bit on the optimistic side,
Mhm.
figure out how that gets done. It gets done with a certain amount of pain, a lot more pain than we're going to experience in the United States. I think it is, though, at the edge of doable even by next winter, and they very, very well may have to.
Very recently, and I should add, for those who are watching this discussion several days from now, that we're speaking on March the 9th, but recently Chinese President Xi Jinping implied something less than full-throated support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It wasn't criticism, but it wasn't fully on board. If for whatever reason China does decide that it doesn't want to see a humiliating Russian defeat, and if it decides it's going to try to help Russia tough out these sanctions, can they do that? Or do they have the economic power to do so?
I don't think so. I think China can help mitigate some of the economic consequences for Russia, but it has only a limited ability. It's a much larger economy than Russia, but it's still way smaller than what Russia's cut itself off from. Second, China's going to want to take advantage of the situation. So they're not going to use this to pay extra for oil to help Russia out. They're going to use this to extract oil at a discount from Russia. And so, a bunch of the benefit of whatever flows in that relationship will go to China, not Russia. And the last thing to understand is China's economy is really being hurt by this. They are, big importers of oil. The oil price here is a political problem in the United States, much more than it's an economic problem. It's a genuine economic problem in China right now. They don't like this type of global economic instability. It's not good for them.
And they're wheat importers from Ukraine, I gather.
Yes, and wheat
pretty,
too.
Pretty big customers. Well, Jason Furman, thank you very much. And I'd like to bring back AbbyJoseph Cohen and JohnCassidy for all three of you now to take part in the question and answer session. I'd like to begin by just putting a question to all of you, and we can start with well, we can go in reverse order with Jason to Abby and then JohnCassidy. If it's possible to say, apart from COVID and apart from Russia, how are we doing? If I can lure you into that theoretical world, how is the economy doing right now, but for those two crises?
I see it as a glass 2/3 full, an extraordinary recovery of GDP, a pretty good recovery of employment, but still a couple million people that haven't re-entered the labor force. But inflation is incredibly high. And so workers have been losing ground for more than a year now, and potentially are going to continue to lose ground for some time. That's tricky-ish thing to navigate. Again, it's much better than the problem of high unemployment and low inflation, but high inflation isn't just an issue that was made up by the media. When families have seen their income fall, almost every month for a year, their wages fall almost every month for a year, there's a reason that they're not happy.
AbbyJoseph Cohen, how full is the glass, is the way you see it?
I concur with much of what Jason has said. Sort of reminds me of that terrible joke about, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how is the play? This has been a very difficult time over the last several years, particularly for middle income and low middle income families in the United States. And one of the things that I had been pleased to see was that wages were beginning to rise pre-pandemic. We've gone through 20, almost 30 years in which median household incomes adjusted for inflation have declined in the United States. Income inequality has risen. And one of the things that the now somewhat tighter labor market is doing for us. And when I say somewhat, the unemployment rate is low, but there's still 2 million jobs missing, is that we see the wages are moving. But what we do need, of course, is to make sure that those people who don't have jobs are able to find good employment. The other thing that I worry about has to do with our long-term competitiveness, not just vis-a-vis other countries, but relative to our own history. And we have fallen behind in terms of how much we are willing as a nation to invest in basic research. We've fallen behind in terms of how much we're willing to spend on education. And the other thing that we often lose sight of is the following. Very often, particularly in Western economies, the pace of economic growth and the health of the economy is often related to labor force growth, population growth. And over the last decade or so, more than half of the increase in workers has come from immigration, both at the lower end of the income spectrum, but also at the upper end. And the restrictions in recent years on visas, the concerns about travel during the pandemic have all contributed in a negative way to what's happened to our labor force. And by the way, keep this in mind, more than 60% of the working PhDs in science and engineering in the United States are immigrants. And if we make it difficult for them to come to the United States and stay here, we're not helping ourselves long-term.
JohnCassidy, thoughts about how the US economy is doing, apart from the obvious?
I think the other panelists covered the past pretty well. I mean, looking forward, I think there's two big issues. One, we basically had another supply side inflation shock here, which is going to make the Fed's task more difficult. They were already getting ready to raise interest rates quite substantially, I think. Now they've got to look at a big oil price shock on top of that. How are they going to deal with that? So that's one issue. Second issue, the financial markets. I'd be interested in Abby's input here too. So far, there's been a sort of what I would call a relative modest sell-off on Wall Street, but nothing. We've had such an enormous bull market over the last 12 years. You know, if you talk to anybody on Wall Street, they say the financial system much safer than it's ever been. Capital ratios at banks are much higher than they used to be. It's nothing like 2006, 2007, 2008. Well, let's see. When you get huge asset price movements, especially as we've seen in the last, you know, if it gets worse, but even in the Russian side, we're already starting to see out of Europe big margin calls on various high wealth individuals. Are there any hedge funds on the wrong side of these movements? You know, we just don't know. The financial system, it's the old Warren Buffett saying, you don't really know who's got their trousers down till the tide goes out. So that's what we'll see here. So I would highlight the inflation shock challenge to the Fed and the possibility of a financial blow up somewhere. That's dangers ahead.
Here's a question that's been submitted by Lauren Ross, who asks, and I'll put this to Jason Furman since you worked in the White House, why can't the US president invoke emergency powers, as was done with the development and acceleration of COVID-19 vaccines, working with oil shale and domestic oil producers to produce nearly self-sufficient oil and gas supplies, especially in the short run?
I mean, the issue isn't self-sufficiency. The United States produces slightly more oil than we consume. We export more oil than we import, but oil is still a global price. And so something that happens anywhere in the world will raise the price of US oil, no matter how much oil we make and no matter how little we have. So the first thing is it's not self-sufficiency. Now, do we want to increase US production? Maybe. There's a set of considerations around the environment. There's also a set of considerations around price. If we want to do that, there's some things maybe they could do using the Defense Production Act, but mostly what they would need to do is one, sort of drop some of the environmental limitations they've made on production. I actually don't think they're that big a deal. I don't think they've raised global prices that much, but if you want to help a little bit, you could do that. And then you could go one step further, which I wouldn't advocate, and say, we'll guarantee you we're going to buy your oil at blank dollars a barrel. $80 a barrel. Now, chances are a guarantee like that wouldn't get exercised because the price is above it, but if the price falls a lot, that would be valuable. That might convince some frackers to continue to frack. And that basically is what we did with the vaccines. We offered to buy it at a certain price. So if we want to give money to the oil companies, we can get them to produce more. Absent that, we don't have a lot of other tools.
Here's a question I'm going to, it was sent to us by Shira Goldman, and I'll put it to JohnCassidy, since you cover politics as well as economics. Could the current situation end up fostering the political will for action on actual progress towards sustainable non-fossil fuel energy sources?
It's a very good question. I actually wrote a column on this subject a couple of days ago. I think the basic answer is up to a point. Biden's environmental climate change package got shot down last year as part of the Build Back Better bill, but it's still out there. Senator Manchin is the key player here. He came out last week and said he's willing to support a smaller package, which most people think is about 1.75 trillion. And the spending on that, a certain amount would go to deficit reduction, he's insisting, and the rest of it would go to climate change and one other domestic issue. So if you look at the figures, it's possible that most of the Biden climate change initiative could be funded through that mechanism. I think the initial figure was about 500 billion. People are talking about maybe 400 billion. You would get most of the tax incentives, most of the subsidies for electric vehicle purchases, etc. There is, I think, now a realistic prospect of that going through. Is that going to satisfy the climate change groups? No, because the original Biden package never satisfied that too. And Manchin is going to knock down a couple of very important elements, including the suggestion for a financial incentives for the electric grid operators to buy renewable fuels and not buy fossil fuels. He won't live with that because that hurts the coal-fired power station. But I think there is, short answer, there is room for progress here.
AbbyJoseph Cohen, thoughts on either of these questions?
Yeah, one of the interesting things to me has been that there has been a natural move towards concern about environmental issues in the United States by investors and by companies, in large part because of some generational changes, and also because the scientific data and the experience that so many people are having with regard to extreme weather and impact, it has led to this kind of discussion. And so what we are seeing still is that companies are being encouraged by their employees, their future prospective employees, the people they want to recruit, to pay attention to these matters. There is one other element with regard to energy, if I may, and that is the incremental producer may not be in the United States. One of the real questions has been, why is it that the Saudis and the Gulf producers have refused, apparently, to speak to the White House about increasing their supplies at this point? And so Jason makes a very important point that energy markets are global. The fact that we import into the United States has more to do with logistics and location of various things, as opposed to how much we actually have. But if we need to increase the global supply to offset shortfalls from Russia, one of the obvious places would be the OPEC producers. I didn't mention Venezuela. And I would be watching carefully in the next several days to see if there is some sort of suasion that the US applies to those various countries.
Our new friends, the Venezuelans. I have a question for the three of you. We'll start with, Jason Furman, you mentioned you see the economy as the glass 2/3 full. Paul Krugman wrote a column the other day that I found very interesting about the funk that Americans are in. And a tremendous number of Americans not only don't see the glass 2/3 full, they see it 3/4 empty. 51% of one polling sample of Americans feel that we're either in a recession or a depression right now. Many Americans say they have no sense of economic growth, or when in fact people are trying to hire all around them. Inflation, I'm just curious, what is that all about? What is happening? Why are we so negative? Why are so many Americans so negative about economic news, which they're experiencing in their own lives. And I would assume that it's essential to the workings of a democratic government when it comes to economics that what the economists think is good as a result of their policies is seen as good by the people who are affected by them. So let's start with Professor Furman first. What's going on?
Right. Part of it is, COVID, polarization, things outside the economy affect people in the economy. But I think we should take seriously what people think about the economy. And I think there actually is some disconnect between what my own public policy preferences are and the way most Americans see the economy. I think the number of jobs we add is incredibly important. I'm really worried about people who are left out of the labor force, re-entering it, people who are unemployed, who are struggling to get by. I'm also really worried about wages of retail workers and fast food workers. Those things have done pretty well in the last year. If you look at the median worker, they had a job a year ago, they have a job now, and that job is paying less adjusted for inflation than it did a year ago. So I think there actually is some disconnect between sort of what I think matters most in the economy and how an awful lot of people are being affected. And just the short version of that is the jobs that are gained, those only really affect the people who got the jobs. Inflation affects everyone. And affects everyone. Partly they magnify the effects in their head because they forget they got a bigger wage increase, but partly in a real and genuine way. Not a lot of workers got a 9% raise last year, enough to keep up with inflation plus a bit more that they'd been used to before.
JohnCassidy, I mean, what you write about economics. Do you feel this disconnect between people out there and people who are writing about the economy?
I think Jason's exactly right. And the difference between the sort of person who is severely affected and the average person who kept his job during the recession, what they've experienced in the last year is basically just a big increase in inflation. Inflation's always a puzzle to economists and historians, because if wages keep up with it, it shouldn't really have such a big political impact. I even remember, again, showing my age a bit here, going back to the 70s and 80s, we used to have those discussions used to take place then when inflation was going to 10 or 15%, and economists and political consultants would say, well, why are the people so furious? Their wages are going up with it too. Real wages didn't collapse in the mid 70s, but people for some reason just hate the sight of higher inflation, especially higher gas prices in the US. It's quite a strong correlation between the president's approval rating and gas prices, which, it's a bit of a mystery really, but it just seems to be there. So I think that is the issue. And it doesn't help when people like us and people economists say, well, inflation's not a big issue. That really gets people's backs up, and they think that the government and people in authority are sort of ignoring their issues.
Do we think that what people are being told about the economy, what they see or hear, Abby Cohen, in the news, that contributes to their judgment as opposed to their own personal experience of what's going on?
Well, I think it can certainly have an impact if there's a drumbeat of economic news that gets presented in a negative way. But we also have to understand that people, for all kinds of good reasons, are on edge. They're on edge because of the difficult experiences many had during the pandemic. They're on edge because of the political polarization in the country. And I also think that there's a loss of credibility that has occurred over the last handful of years, particularly among, the so-called elites or the policymakers, where many individuals basically are not quite sure what to believe, who to believe, and we've turned, in many cases, into a nation of cynics. This is actually something a little bit different for us. We, as Americans, have tended to be a nation of optimists, and now we're kind of grouchy.
Here's a question, which I'll broaden. The question is, does cryptocurrency provide Vladimir Putin with the means to circumvent sanctions? I will broaden that to ask all three of you. Do you think cryptocurrency affects anything of what we've been talking about so far? And if so, how? Abby, we can start with you.
Yeah, a cryptocurrency is certainly cryptic to many people. There is the belief that there's a great deal of crypto trading in Russia, something that the Russians had hoped would give them a way around some of the economic sanctions. As was discussed earlier, sanctions on the SWIFT system, a messaging system, kind of soft, mushy kind of sanction. The bigger sanction was freezing a lot of the FX reserves. We believe, by the way, that many of those reserves were in China, and the Chinese can't convert those reserves for the Russians into rubles. So, the hope of many Russians was that they could use crypto, and it's turning out not to be quite the case because there's so many other things that are getting in the way. One of the concerns I have writ large about financial markets has to do with the role of crypto. At this point, still the lion's share of cryptocurrency trading has no economic rationale. It's more trading for trading's sake. If the data we've seen are to be believed, about half of the remainder has to do with illicit economic activities or things we don't want our mothers to know about. Something on the order of 5% of crypto trading has to do with legitimate economic activity. Now, the hope on the part of those who are strong believers in crypto is that that 5% will grow and will grow notably. But thus far it hasn't. And one of the things to keep in mind is we've not yet seen the impact of what happens when a sovereign nation like the United States introduces a digital dollar. That is a digital currency which actually has the backing of the country, has the backing of the revenues, the tax revenues of that country and so on. And what happens to this presumed value of these other digital currencies? In the meantime, what's the role right now for some of these crypto currencies with regard to Russia? It doesn't seem to be helping them, at least at this point. But of course, the information we're getting out of Russia right now is very limited.
So the digital dollar that you mentioned would match cryptocurrency in terms of its medium, I suppose, but not in the sense that it's independent of any central bank. It would reflect the value of the dollar.
It would indeed, and of course, all of this should be a little bit separate in discussion from blockchain, which is a real mechanism, blockchain as a computerized system for inventory control and a whole host of other keeping track of orders, keeping track of revenue, keeping track of financial transactions, very important, but that is just the tool behind several of the cryptos.
Yeah. JohnCassidy, does cryptocurrency come up anywhere in your consideration and writing about the economy, the war in Ukraine, inflation?
There's obviously a potential sort of financial transmission mechanism if some of the big crypto players get into trouble and that sort of feeds back into the financial system somehow. We haven't really seen that so far. I mean, I think what we've seen over the last 6 months, even before the war, but the war has accentuated, is that cryptocurrency, the whole appeal of it is it's supposed to behave orthogonally to the rest of the financial system. It's supposed to be a store of value. Turns out to be just like an internet stock. When internet stocks go up, crypto goes up. When internet stocks go down, crypto goes down. It's just another risk-on asset. So I think it's been a blow actually to cryptocurrencies, what we've seen in the last 6 months, although of course none of the boosters will ever admit that.
Jason Furman, in the non sequitur of the day, I believe you have a college roommate who's flogging cryptocurrency on television these days. Tell me, does cryptocurrency have any relation to either Putin's strategy or what's happening to the U.S. economy?
Right. Whenever I have a chance, I flog cryptocurrency, but flog in a very different meaning of the word than I think you had just intended. Right. I agree with everything that Abby and John said. I think both of them were probably too polite. The use cases here are mostly terrible, and the risks and costs and downsides are non-trivial. And I worry, Robert, that the reason that people won't like a digital dollar from the U.S. government isn't that they're trying to be free of the U.S. government. They're trying to have something that doubles in value every 3 months. They're trying to have a so-called stable coin that's guaranteed to give them a 20% interest rate and is completely safe. They're trying, in other words, to have a set of fantastical things that no one can offer them. And hopefully the lesson was learned over the last couple weeks and couple months. But hope springs eternal among some.
Here's an important question for whoever wants to address it, and that can be all three of you. But we've been sanctioning Iran for quite a while now, and we can make some judgments about what's been accomplished. What might we learn from U.S. sanctions against Iran that could be applicable in sanctioning Russia? Who wants to try that one first? Jason Furman.
I mean, one thing is that they're just not guaranteed to succeed in their ultimate goal. Sanctions probably played a big role in apartheid ending in South Africa and changing the position of the business community and many within South Africa. There aren't a lot of unambiguous success cases where a regime that was bent on doing one thing, turned around and did another. Venezuela has suffered an enormous amount. Iran has suffered quite a lot. Now, I think it's probably given us some leverage, and we'll get some things on the nuclear program in exchange for this. So I don't think it's nothing, but countries that are run by autocrats, that have a set of goals that go far beyond the economy, have proven the ability to withstand quite a lot. I'm afraid there's a decent chance that's the case with Russia, but it's not like I have a better option for us to pursue. Beyond arming the Ukrainians even more than we already are. So, would pursue this one too.
JohnCassidy, do you agree with that appraisal?
I do, yes. I mean, I'd only say I think Russia's a bit different just in that it's a first big sort of advanced economy to face sanctions of this nature. And the attack on the central bank is a sort of novelty for a G20 country. Parts of Russia are quite well integrated into the rest of the Western economies, so they may be more vulnerable. Is there a vulnerability there for Putin because his power base are the oligarchs who have got a lot of Western exposure, etc.? I don't know. I mean, Jason's exactly right. Of course, the lesson of history is that sanctions can do a bit, but they can't displace a sort of authoritarian regime from doing what it wants, going all the way back to 1936 and the invasion of Abyssinia by Mussolini. And the League of Nations introduced huge sanctions. That's generally been the case. South Africa is a counterexample. Some people do say, going back to the question, that Iran is a counterexample, and that one of the reasons the Iranians are willing to discuss the nuclear deal was because of sanctions, and that's another reason why they may be willing to discuss it again now quickly. I mean, that would be one thing we haven't mentioned is, if we do get a new Iranian nuclear deal next month or so, that might have quite a significant impact on the oil market because they're a big oil exporter. And I would imagine there are people inside the US government who are working very hard on that now. And they're getting chivied along by the political people in the White House.
AbbyJoseph Cohen, thoughts on sanctions? I guess we sanctioned Cuba for about as long as we've sanctioned anyone. And the Cubans certainly hung in there. The Castro brothers did not say, well, we'll cry uncle.
Yeah, one of the key things about the sanctions against Russia, Robert, has been how well coordinated they have been. I would say that the Biden administration has worked tirelessly with our economic allies, and the coordination has really been quite surprising. Now, some people might argue it took them too long to get agreement among so on, but it has occurred, number one. And number two, the thing that I find even more interesting, and this is very different than some of the other sanctions we've seen in history, has been that private players have stepped in as well. The scenes of commuters in Moscow not being able to ride the subway because Apple Pay wasn't working, for example. The withdrawal, at least temporarily, of McDonald's and Starbucks. One might argue these are not big items from an economic standpoint, but they do send a political PR kind of message, which is quite distinct from what has happened in some of the other economic sanctions. And very importantly, it's not just the United States with sanctions against a country. It is truly very large number of economies doing this.
Abby Cohen, Jason Furman, JohnCassidy, thanks to all three of our panelists for joining us today. Many thanks as well to Joshua Plout, Nate Bonzani, Ronnie Giuliano, and Adrienne Kiss of American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, and to our technical director, Sam Lunetta. Also, thanks to today's program sponsor, Crown Acquisitions. Global Connections is produced by the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. The group's website is www.afrmc.org. That's a 501c3 national charitable organization representing in the United States Israel's largest hospital, Rabin Medical Center, which is in Petah Tikva in Greater Tel Aviv. Join us next month for Russia, a new Cold War, with guests Ivo Dalder, used to be U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Robin Wright of the Wilson Center, Professor Kimberly Martin of Barnard College, and Donald Jensen of the U.S. Institute of Peace. I'm Robert Siegel. This has been Global Connections, Navigating the New Normal. See you next month. Stay healthy and stay safe.